Welcome to the Missions Podcast, the show that explores your hard questions on missions, theology, and practice to help goers think and thinkers go. I'm Alex Kocman, Director of Advancement and Mobilization for ABWE, and the episode we have coming up for you today is a special presentation of a breakout recorded at the GARBC annual conference, which was live streamed this year, on the topic of what it takes to become a next-level sending church. And what does that even mean? The panel featured myself, Scott Dunford, West Coast mobilizer and lead church planter for Redeemer Church in Fremont, California. You know him well. And of course, ABWE's own President Paul Davis. Enjoy the show. My name is Alex Kocman. I'm Director of Advancement and Mobilization for ABWE International. This is Paul Davis, President of ABWE. And we're also joined by Scott Dunford out on the West Coast. He's our West Coast mobilizer, and he's played a key role within ABWE over the years. And would love just to give you guys a chance to introduce yourself and how you came to work with ABWE, and then we'll dive in. We want to talk about what it means to be a next-level sending church.
I'm Scott Dunford. I was a missionary with ABWE in East Asia, and then served in the home office for a number of years as Vice President for Mobilization and Communications. And then most recently, I moved out to the West Coast, where I still serve as the West Coast mobilizer for ABWE, as well as hosting the Mission Podcast with Alex. And I'm also planting a church out here. So we're Redeemer Church of Fremont, California, and enjoying the ministry out here in this very needy mission field of the West Coast. So good to be with you.
Well, Scott and Alex, I'm Paul Davis. I'm the president of ABWE, and it's been my delight to be a part of ABWE for the last 2.5 years or so. Before that, we were involved in pastoring a church, sending missionaries from our church, supporting missionaries, being a part of the Great Commission work. And we were focused in Holland, Michigan. And we were there for 21 years serving our local church. We were able to plant another church as well. And so we enjoyed both church planting and supporting missionaries and pastoring a church there.
So we want to have a conversation about what it means to be not just a sending church, but a next level sending church. And we were kind of joking about that before the broadcast started. All right, what does that really mean? There's not a single church out there. There's nobody that's watching or listening now that would think, hey, I don't want my church to send missionaries. But Paul, I want to move to you. You were a church, you were pastoring a church that was very serious about sending missionaries. So for you, how would you define that? What does it mean to be a next level sending church? What did that look like for you in your context when you were in pastoral ministry?
Yeah, I think one of the things that is the difference between just a church that thinks about sending and a church that's actually sending is a proactivity. And one of the things that I think churches need to be thinking constantly about is reproducing leadership, and then taking both the risk of releasing people to the world, and be thinking about that intentionally at the very beginning. In other words, when Jesus said, follow me and I will make you fishers of men, I think at the very beginning, as we fish for men, as we begin the discipleship process, and the Holy Spirit begins engaging in the lives of people, we should, from the very beginning, be thinking about how we can release them to ministry, whether within the local body for sure, but also, is this person uniquely gifted and equipped to go cross-cultural? So I think a next level sending church is a church that's being very proactive in their discipleship process, thinking about release at the very beginning. Scott, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah.
Well, I agree. A lot of churches are missions churches in the sense they support missionaries. And I think obviously that's an important role. But really, to see the missionary movement continue to grow, it isn't just about money, because if you're just sending dollars, eventually that motivation runs out. It really, I feel like I've seen churches take that next step when they actually go from sending their dollars to the mission field to sending their sons and daughters to the mission field. And so that isn't just an easy transition. In fact, that's a really painful transition. And I just want to kick it back to you guys. What are some of those things that help to create a culture in the church where missions is just part of life, and where young men and young women are trained to think not just about vocational ministry and about how to use their gifts within the local context, but also thinking internationally? How do you build that culture that has a sending component to it?
I want to let Paul share some of his thoughts. Him and I have had multiple conversations about how Charles Finney relates to this. And I'm just going to throw that out there, and I'll let Paul pick up on that, because that's a thread that Paul has thought about often. But along those lines, I think that one thing we struggle to do, and I think it comes from a good impulse, we don't want to pressure people in a way that seems disingenuous. But I do think that for those of us who are in ministry, we're afraid to make the ask, whether it's a large capital campaign in an overseas context, whether it's, hey, maybe you just need to be the one to go overseas and serve. But I believe we're afraid to be that direct. I think it perhaps reflects on our own internal feelings of guilt. Hey, I know I should have done this years ago and I'm not doing it, so I'm not in a position to challenge people that way. And maybe we need to be more confident in our own callings so that we can be secure enough in ourselves to say, I'm operating in what I believe the will of God is for me, and I just actually want to directly challenge you to do whatever that is for you. I think that can come into our preaching, but I think there's other things that we can do, even just visually, the displays that we erect in the walls of our church and the maps that we might display. As silly as some of that sounds, I think visually there's elements that we can do. But getting back to that idea of pressuring, and do we push or do we wait for people to respond? Paul, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah. Charles Finney is known for what was called the anxious bench, right? He would preach a sermon and call people to the anxious bench, where they would feel convicted and conviction, and it was very emotional. And I think many churches, when it comes to sending, their thoughts are, let's preach a very powerful message, or let's bring in a hired gun. Like, let's bring in somebody let's bring in a missionary, and let's bring them in. And if they have a powerful message, the Holy Spirit will work, and someone will be convicted and go into missions from that time. And don't get me wrong, I believe in the power of preaching. I believe in the power of the Holy Spirit moving and preaching, and I think proclamational ministry is critically important. But I think there's a more strategic way that churches can be calling people into missions than, and I think a sermon is important. But I think godly men, elders of a church, leaders of a church, they need to have their finger on the pulse of the congregation, looking for people specifically who are gifted. Those who are gifted with evangelism, those who are gifted with teaching, those who are gifted with other ministry gifts that would be useful on the mission field. And instead of preaching a general message, I think we need to have conversations with these young men and couples and women who God would be calling into ministry, and proactively have a conversation. And, Alex, we've talked about this a lot. Both of us have talked about, there were key men in our lives who had key conversations with us. And I think one of the reasons I'm in ministry today is because a very respected spiritual leader in my life came up to me and he gave me the potential talk. Paul, you've got so much potential if you would just, address these issues in your life, and if you would work on these. And I think churches that are sending well are proactively looking for gifted people, and then having a conversation with them that looks something like, we see gifts of ministry in you. And if you were to pursue missions, if you were to pursue ministry, we would be on board with helping you with the next steps. We would be on board with supporting you as you engage in those steps because we see the spiritual maturity in you. And taking that very proactive approach as opposed to just waiting for someone to come forward on a Sunday during a sermon. And Scott, I think men have had that conversation with you too.
Yeah, I mean, I was just thinking, about that, and it takes a level of intentionality, right? So a next level sending church is not just wishing and hoping, but they're also praying and planning that this would take place. And I can think back to even my own experiences, and just being a pastor. I mean, we were a sending church with ABWE when I pastored in Michigan, and knowing that a lot of churches, and including one that I pastored, it was month to month, and really trying to say like, I hope we can make it this month financially. But churches that were kind of taking that next step were thinking proactively of saying, okay, we're going to set aside money in our missions budget because we want to send out our own person, and starting identifying and praying and planning and making that known to the congregation that we are preparing and planning to send out a missionary, and funds are being set aside for that very purpose. And when that's happening, that just starts to create this culture of who's next. And it kind of, I want to bring this back to you, Paul, and Alex. You're in a small church, Alex. I'm in a small church. And I'm thinking right now, we have on a Sunday morning, if we have 50 people, we're pretty happy about that. That meant no one was sick and no one's on vacation. And if I were to have one of my best and brightest members come to me, someone that we're training for leadership, come to me and say, God's calling us to missions. I mean, I feel like I'm as passionate about missions as anyone, and yet it would still be a little bit of a sinking feeling, Right. And I think that a lot of pastors probably listening in on this probably feel some of that same tension, right, of wanting to send missionaries, but also nervous about that. So, Paul, I want to ask you, and Alex, I would like you to chime in on this too. Is there a time that a church could be too missions focused? Is it sending all the time, or how do we balance that distinction between the need to grow a church here and be effective where we're located, but also this deep desire and call of Christ to send out to the nations?
Yeah, if I could hop in on that real quick, there was a church that I had done some pulpit supply at several years ago. Sweet church, full of a handful of older saints, but unfortunately was dying. And on a typical Sunday, maybe 15 people there. But it was not just small, it was clearly breathing its last gasps as a congregation. And I remember talking to one of I think he was a deacon, figuring out, where are you guys at? How's this going? They were in a pastoral search and found out they had been in a pastoral search for, I think, a year and a half, maybe as many as 2 years at that point. Come to find out that they've got maybe a dozen people. I mean, maybe if everyone showed up, they would have 30. But they were not willing to hire a full-time pastor because they didn't have the budget for it. They only wanted to hire somebody at a part-time salary. And you know how these search committees tend to go. The qualification level, he needs to basically be the Apostle Paul or Jesus. But we'll pay him about $25,000 a year kind of thing. But come to find out that I think it was as much as $50,000 of their annual budget was going towards missions. And you should have seen this board in the back that was just plastered with, all these pins on the World Atlas about all of the works that they were supporting overseas. I do think you can be too missions focused, at least in terms of you can be too missions focused in terms of overseas mission to the expense of local mission. Theirs was a community that had a number of Slavs, a number of Eastern European people, a lot of nominal Orthodox who needed to be engaged with the gospel in a really intentional way, and no outreach was happening along those lines. So I've seen that myself, to where the focus can be too much in that direction. But as far as pastors worried about losing their best, and I'm curious what Paul thinks about this, but as far as pastors worried about losing their best, I just go back to, the joke we all tell about what is Baptist church planting, right? If a church splits, people kind of him and hawing like, oh, there's Baptist church planting going on. But think of all of the silly reasons that we lose some of our best people. In our small church, we just lost a couple through it was a decision that everybody talked about and agreed on, and everybody left on good terms. But it was a couple that was highly gifted. He had been an elder in the church. There was a lot of goodwill there, but some things have changed in the life of their family and the life of the church, and some transition in leadership, and they are now looking a different direction as far as the local church that they attend. Think of all of the silly reasons that we've lost people. Think of all of the church splits that have happened. What if we talk to pastors about that in a different way? Get out ahead in front of your next conflict. Instead of having these conversations reactively, how can we keep these people that we might lose for one superficial reason or another? Hop in now while the relationship is healthy. And before Satan has a chance to stir division, say, would you now pray about that? And maybe it's something as simple as your small group splitting in two, right? So that people don't all have a holy huddle. Maybe it's you just split that there. You try that. And then maybe it's, maybe you guys need to move 20 minutes west and start a second location for our church. It's simple things like that, as well as making the bigger asks about life overseas.
Can I just interject here before, Paul, because I want you to take a little bit more time on this, but I just want to give one example. So the church I pastored in Michigan, some of you listening will know it. It's called Perry Baptist Church. It's a small church, small town. You only know Perry if you're driving from Lansing to Flint and need gas. And a lot of people stop there at the Wendy's or Burger King or whatever. Not Wendy's, McDonald's. And but anyway, years ago, one family felt called by God to go to Africa as missionaries. They went overseas for 4 years. In that 4 years, 2 of their children got sick and died and were buried in Africa. The wife's health was ruined. Emotionally, they were devastated. Ended up sadly having to come home after one term and always wanted to go back, never could go back. But because of the impact of that God had done in that family's life, when they came back to the States, God blessed him financially. He became not wealthy in a huge way, but wealthy enough to be very generous in the area of missions. And from the testimony and the attitude and the feeling that came from that one family, the whole culture of the church changed. And not only did the culture of the church change regarding sending overseas missionaries, it also changed regarding thinking about the lost around them. And the church ended up buying a missions home that allowed missionaries to stay there. They were on furlough. And out of that little bitty church in a tiny little town that it's just a drive-through town, dozens of missionaries were sent out, including us. And it really came down to one family being willing to go that didn't even get to stay very long, that were a catalyst to lots of missionaries serving around the world. So it's interesting how God works. I'm sure the church never wanted, at that time, they were so unhealthy. I'm sure that they weren't thrilled about sending out, this family. And yet God used it in a way beyond what anyone at that time would have known. So, Paul, I want to kick that to you. I just wanted to share that story that I experienced myself.
Yeah. And, I think you can overdo anything, right? So let's just put that on the table first off. You can get out of balance on, almost any good thing. But I'll tell you a story about my church and time in Holland. When we decided to plant a church, we immediately had to find 2 people to do everything that we had one person doing before. And when we sent a team of about 75 people to plant that church, it immediately left so many holes in our church. But what it did, and you used the word catalyze, Scott. What it did is it catalyzed leadership development in our church, and people that weren't using their gifts currently, or people that were on the fringe, or not even a part of our church, fresh people that were won to Christ, and immediately had a place where they could plug in and serve and engage in ways that had those people not left, we would have never put them in. We would have said, well, you need 2 years of discipleship, but we needed a nursery worker today, right? So we're going to plug you in immediately. So I think there is a sense that it's only when we do release people that we will see the opportunities for fresh discipleship and fresh leadership development. And that was a huge step of faith for me. And to be honest with you, I wasn't real happy about it. Pastorally, I wanted to plant a church, but some of the people that were going to plant a church, I was like, really? Why don't you stay? We'll send someone else, right? And I never told anyone that, but in my heart, I was saying that. But 6-8 months into it, when we saw all the new people that were engaged in ministry leadership and the way that they were blossoming, I realized that releasing that is the catalyst for new missions development. So I also think too, and I don't want to super spiritualize this, but I also think too, there's a lesson to be learned here from Abraham, right? God blessed Abraham so that he could be a blessing, right? And so many times I, in ministry leadership, think God's blessing me so I can be blessed. But anything God is blessing us with, it's so that we can in turn be a blessing. And so those great people that we maybe want to hold on to, those I think are the very people, because they're such a blessing to us as ministry leaders, right? Those are the very people that I think God wants us to use to be a blessing to others. So.
Yeah, and that's challenging because I can pull from my own experiences to think of times that we've had to part ways with people in a church, and they've been awesome relationships that you don't want to lose. I think there is this degree of we have to brace ourselves for those sorts of good breaks in the name of mission, but relational breaks, because on this side of eternity, we don't have always the luxury of staying in the huddle. Let me just throw out a few other things and let Scott turn a corner a little bit in our conversation. Bill and Cathy Britton are watching, and we're glad you guys are watching. Bill and Cathy are ABWE missionaries, and as you guys interact with them throughout the conference, feel free to say hi to them. But Bill and Cathy were just appointed with us as long-termers in March, and they wrote a few things. First, how do you become a sending church, a really intentional, strategic one? Fostering a relationship with missionaries in the fields where they serve helps build enthusiasm and interest. And it seems obvious to say, but we've got to be careful that we don't get into this ditch where we think of sending as only from us to the rest of the world. There's so much happening among national believers, indigenous churches already, where sending may not start with the minute that you say to a couple, hey, we are going to fully pay your way so that you can be supported missionaries in a foreign context. That might be the last step in the process. There might be a bunch of steps before that, including adopting an unreached people group. In fact, ABWE's Live Global initiative, liveglobal.org/unreached, we'll put the URL in a place where you can see it. But that initiative gives people an opportunity to adopt an unreached people group, build a connection as a church, not just your leadership team, your whole congregation, with a national partner in that context, with whom you can form that trust. That person is someone who's been vetted by missionaries who understand the culture, and so you can trust that the work that's happening there is of quality, and there's all sorts of things that can happen that get lost in translation, but these are vetted partners. And then through small initiatives requiring, maybe you just take a special offering, maybe it's $1,200, something that a pastor could easily take a special offering on a given Sunday morning and get $1,200 depending on your congregation size, small gifts, things like that, and begin with these small steps of paying for a gospel tract in that people group's language, paying for a team of nationals to go and distribute that. Then maybe, each pastor is if you're taking a missions trip each year, don't just take a missions trip as a pastor to kind of put another notch in the belt. Bring someone with you, bring that person with you that your church might envision sending out at some point. I just think that the problem is we envision the end goal, which is missionaries sent. We don't always think about all of the steps that have to happen along the way. Those are some good steps there. And then another practical thing that Bill and Cathy mentioned is letting missionaries address the congregation. It highlights the priority of missions and opportunities, he wrote to us. That's another hard thing for pastors, to actually sacrifice pulpit time. It's hard. It's hard. And more churches, there's more and more pressure, especially post-COVID, right? With so many churches live streaming, there is such an intentionality that's good about guarding your church's voice in person, digitally, protecting your pulpit, protecting your content, protecting your space that way. But maybe the most sacrificial thing you can do is giving up a week in the pulpit. Maybe your wife and family would thank you for that anyway. There's all sorts of practical things we can do here.
Alex, Bill shared, the first part of the sentence is fostering relationships with missionaries. How many stories have we heard while we're mobilizing missionaries, and testimonies that we've heard where new missionaries will say, well, when I was growing up, my parents had missionaries over for dinner.
Oh, yeah.
And they share these stories of where their family engaged with a missionary one-on-one in a close, intimate context, usually over a meal or something. And so these relationships aren't just speaking in a church, right? But finding creative ways for missionaries and, again, gifted people or people with ministry, just potential to spend time together, just to rub off on one another and let the gospel do its work in people's lives.
And sometimes in small churches, there can be a tendency to say, well, we don't, to feel inadequate, right? So we can't support a missionary right now. We're barely paying, the pastor's salary and our rent or our mortgage, whatever the case may be. So we can't have missionaries in. And I'm telling you, pastors, any missionary worth their salt, if you say to them, I'm pretty sure we can't support you, but we want to promote missions in our church. So would you come and just share your heartbeat about missions? A missionary worth their salt will be thrilled to do that. And so don't be shy about that. And I've seen so many times in our own life when a pastor said, we'd love to have you, but we just, we're not can't support any missionaries. And I would say, if it's just about that, if there's some other reason you don't like me, that's fine. But if it's just about money, have us come anyway, because that will start fostering in your people a love and a heart for missions. And it's amazing when people start catching a vision, how there usually is more money. It's just in their pocket and they don't feel motivated to give it until you give them a motivation to give it. And we experienced that so many times. The churches that ended up supporting us the most and the individuals that support us the most were often people that said they had no money to give, and they found that God led them to give. And so I just want to encourage you to keep pressing in that area, even when you don't feel like you can. And if it's okay, I'm going to transition the question unless one of you wanted to jump in. But so Paul, I'm sure a lot of these guys, maybe they knew you from seminary or knew you when you were in Holland. So you went from a pastor, now you're a president of a mission agency. And I'm curious, but I'm sure others are curious as well. What have you learned that now that you're on this side of the table that you wish you could go back and tell your old self, hey, Pastor Paul, this is what I've learned in missions from the agency angle, that you would tell him and what would change in the way you lead local church missions based on what you see from this current situation you're in? Right. That makes sense?
Yeah, there are so many things, Scott. So, a do-over would be very nice. But I think one of the biggest things that is the vastness of the work of the gospel around the globe, that the opportunities are literally endless. And any skill, I would have men in my church, maybe a guy's a welder, and he would say, I'm just a welder. What could God can't use me. I'm just a welder. And, I joined ABWE and I find out that like a welder would be an awesome missionary, right? And he could help disciple a bunch of welders in a country where welding as a skill, teaching welding would be so valuable. And I wish I could go back to myself and say, Paul, talk to the welders in your church and give them a vision to use welding for the kingdom. Talk to the construction guys in your church. Talk to the people that see their skills and say, well, I'm not a pastor. I can't preach. I can't, so I'll teach second grade Sunday school. Well, if you can teach second grade Sunday school, you have teaching gifts, and those can be used anywhere in the world. And there's a lot of other things, Scott, but I think that's the biggest thing. I think I knew it intellectually, but it wasn't until I started seeing, what 1,200 missionaries are doing around the globe, and that they're literally using every skill and gift in a church that shows up, and they've somehow twisted it and used it in a different culture, in a different context, for the sake of the gospel. And there's an intellectual side that I got it, but I didn't get it. I didn't see it. And I wish I had. I'm going to tear up here a second. I would invest in men differently had I thought that every one of them could be used like I see missionaries being used, and how powerful a craft can be for the sake of the gospel. So,
I think that's also wise for those who are discipling younger people. I was a youth pastor in a role prior to serving with ABWE. Those are working with college students. There's this tendency, as soon as somebody expresses an interest in learning more about scripture, learning theology, they start reading books by dead guys, right? That we immediately throw them into a seminary, throw them into some sort of program, and we immediately specialize them as vocational ministers, when we ought to at least have the conversation of, is there a practical skill that you need to pick up just in case God would call you to the work of ministry and the ministry of the word, but do so in a context where just being full-time in ministry isn't going to do that for you. A place where you are going to need a skill as a platform, not just as an excuse to get into a country on a visa, but something legitimate to offer the community. Scott's background was in running a business and business as mission, and starting a business in Asia. And there's lots of significance to that. The other thing is, I would imagine that those who are pastors on this call are thinking, they're thinking of someone in particular, that engineer, that construction worker, that elementary school teacher in their church who has a heart for the lost. And as we're talking about this, that person's face is flashing in your mind. One of the things that we want to challenge you with, this is another one of the links that's in the channel there for you, abwe.org/demo. It's our 24-hour demo event. And we just want to share, it's a time where you can come to our headquarters in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, meet with us, meet with veteran missionary leaders from across the 70 countries where we serve, sit down one-on-one in breakouts as well as large group sessions, but get this one-on-one time as well with somebody who has served a significant portion of their life overseas. And literally bring your resume and say, all right, this is who I am. This is my skills. What can you do with me overseas? Because that's missing. There's so much ambiguity in
and
this.
Come
we
with
can
them,
envision,
pastors. Come with them.
Yeah, come with them. Absolutely. Come with them. Bring them with you, and say, hey, I'm here to support you. So I've noticed this gifting in you. Would you come with me to Harrisburg? That's where that can lead. I think it's an important thing for us to envision practically what are these next steps we can take.
And
if you can't afford to come, talk to Alex. He'll just take it right out of his budget and pay for you to come.
I'm not kidding. That's true. That is a legitimate option.
There we go.
Alex@abwe.org. We will have hey, I can always say no. I mean, if 100 people email me, maybe I'll start saying no. But if like 2 people email me, then that's an actual option. So I'm dead serious, Alex@abwe.org.
I'd also mention, Alex, you talked about bringing your resume and having your resume there. One of the exciting things that we see at the 24-hour demo is second career people, right? who actually have a tremendous resume, and they've got all of this experience and all of this maturity, and they're 50 or 60 years old, and they've got lots of energy, but they've got this this maturity that could really there's a lot of walls that they don't have to tear down when they go on the mission field, and so I love the fact that there's first career people. There's 20 somethings that are looking to engage in full-time ministry, but also there's so many second career people that are looking for opportunities to end serving the kingdom and serving Jesus Christ with all of their life.
Scott, I've got a question for you. I mean, you posed a question to Paul. Paul's been on both ends of the table as somebody working on the agency side and somebody working on the sending church side. Well, you're a sending church pastor. You've been a missionary. You're a church planter now on the West Coast. So what are some of the things that you've seen and you felt as you were a missionary, as you were raising support, that you experienced when you were preparing to go overseas? What is it that the missionaries are thinking, I need this from my sending church? Obviously, there's financial needs. Obviously, there's prayer needs. But channeling the missionaries that may be in the audience, what is it that you're hungering to receive from your sending body?
Such a good question. And, first of all, I would say, like, pastors, do not stop pastoring your missionaries just because they're now going to the mission field. And that it's I've seen it many times. I experienced it where it's like, okay, now they're in full-time ministry. So like kind of hands off, go get them, Paul. You're their pastor now, and obviously we know that theologically and ecclesiologically that's not true. But I feel like the best sending churches are sending churches that take like jealous ownership of their missionaries and really care for them. I've talked to so many pastors over this COVID time that are struggling, like they're discouraged, they're frustrated, we're not in touch with our people the same way we like to be. We have people that are hurting and we can't just maybe be in the hospital with them and holding their hand and praying with them. We can't read their faces while we're preaching. And a lot of pastors are struggling spiritually. They be in the word, be in prayer, stay productive. Well, your missionaries are going through the same things. Mm-hmm. And I had some great pastors that would pick up the phone and not assume that because I was a missionary that now I was another level of godliness, but would say, are you being a good husband? Like, this week, probably not. Like I've been so focused on getting our ministry going and learning the language and trying to survive in this country that's challenging that I've probably neglected my wife a little bit this week, and are you being a good dad? And are you, there's temptations on different fields that are they're so different than at home, and anonymous ways to get into lots of bad trouble, and missionaries do get into trouble. Well, having a pastor that's going to look them in the eye, that knows them better than even their team may know them at the beginning, and say, are you being holy sexually? Are you guarding your thoughts and mind in the middle of spiritual warfare? Knowing your people are praying for you, having notes and not being forgotten, because that is a hard thing when the first Thanksgiving rolls around or football season starts or whatever is big in your area, and you start seeing all the people get together at that party that you always went to, and now you're not there, and finding ways to include, your missionaries and let them know that they're not forgotten, that they're being prayed for and cared for. And then a couple more things that I've seen some churches do so well, and I was very jealous of this. One was when they transition home for their furlough break, that they just took care of them. Like you forget, like you need furniture, you need a car, you need how to get around. You're tired and you feel pressured to do all this ministry stuff, and you really need to rest. And even for a pastor, when a guy's coming home off the field and saying, like, I think God's maybe transitioned me in ministry, for a pastor to go, time out, take a long break, get some sleep, rest up, and then let's talk about what God's doing. That's huge. And then, like, the last thing I want to say, so I don't monopolize everything, would be really care for missionary kids. So, Paul and I, we're at that age now where, Paul's got his last one in college. I've got one in college, one on the way, and then one next year. And it's heart-wrenching, but I'm also looking at it like, okay, I'm in a good situation. I can get in a plane and go see my kid. I can fly them home if I need to. But if you're overseas overseas, let's say you're in Peru and your kid's going to Cedarville or Faith, that's hard, and it's hard in your ministry. And so knowing that you have a church family that doesn't go like, we don't know that kid, but like, we know them, they're ours, and they might not remember me, but I don't care. I'm Uncle Scott, and I care about you, and I'm going to be in your life, and you're getting a care package, and you're getting an invitation for Thanksgiving, even if you turn it down, and you're going to get a Christmas present, and if you need a flight home, our church is going to step up to make that happen. I mean, that just relieves so much pressure from a missionary, but that's what good sending churches do. And so churches, I know that you may be small, maybe you're not small, but be thinking creatively about, what would you need if you were overseas? How would that feel? It's not just natural. You don't come reprogrammed if you're a missionary to think differently about your children when they go overseas, So thinking through some of those things. That's what I wish I knew as a pastor.
Mm-hmm. I want to encourage everybody that's here to feel free to place a question in the chat. If there's something that you want us to address, we would love to be able to talk about that. This is going to be put into a podcast format and available later. If you follow ABWE's podcast, it's called simply The Missions Podcast, missionspodcast.com. This will premiere as long as we can get the recording that way. It'll be available. So feel free to drop a note, and we'd love to interact with you guys in the final 15 minutes that we have remaining. But I want to shift gears slightly and aim this first at Paul. I was talking to a new friend, met him at the gym, found out he was a believer, and then saw him later yesterday. We took our kids to the pool. It was a beautiful day, boiling hot, perfect pool weather. Saw him there. I said, "Oh, what are the odds of this?" And so we got to talking, and I asked him, "So what do you do for a living?" And he says, "Oh, well, I'm an itinerant minister." "Oh, well, interesting. Let's talk a little bit more about that." And he's somebody who travels, who organizes youth rallies, who does a lot of itinerant ministry, preaching to youth groups, sharing the gospel, bringing people to a point of decision, those sorts of things. But what was interesting as we spoke was he's talking about so much of what he does depends on, in a city like ours, pulling together youth pastors from that context and saying, let's do a shared event. Like, you might only have 10 kids, you might only have 50 kids. And let's combine this, do a rally, let's collaborate together. He's doing those sorts of things often. And one of the things you realize is how hard it is for pastors and churches to agree to do that. Now, thankfully, none of us have ever been hesitant to collaborate, but I think there is this tendency that we have in ministry, don't we, that if I'm going to do it right, I'm going to do it myself. And our church is building our own private empire. Of course, we would never put it that way. But I think we are often so slow to, now we'll network with other pastors, but as far as partnering with other churches, sharing resources, sharing our lives together, we're very slow to do those things. Maybe that's a byproduct of our ecclesiology. We believe in the autonomy of the local church. And yes, and amen to that. But there can certainly be a downside to that, to where we don't collaborate as much as we ought to. So the question is this, is we all recognize that the Great Commission depends on churches, not outside agencies, organizations, missions groups, missions agencies that send themselves. But the heart is the local church, but there's more to the body than the heart. There's arms, there's legs, there's feet. So Paul, what are some of the ways that a missions agency, in your mind, having been on the sending church side, not just being the president of an organization, how can a missions agency actually help? And we want to be cards on the table. We all represent ABWE, but we also want to look at this biblically. We think missions agencies, while not in scripture, the concept and justification is biblical. So what can an agency do from your standpoint?
Well, and I can tell you the philosophy of ABWE, you could think of it best as a ministry of helps. The Great Commission was not given to ABWE. The Great Commission was not given to any mission sending agency. The Great Commission was given to the body of Christ, the local body of Christ, the church. And so a ministry like ABWE is only helpful as much as she serves the local church and can provide the ministry of helps in appropriate ways. And some of the ways that we've found that we can help are ways that, quite honestly, people have gotten themselves in trouble in the past. And there are things like health issues and family dynamic issues and counseling issues and training issues and financial issues. All of these can be trouble spots when people travel cross-culturally. And so as a ministry agency or a missions agency, what we want to do is we want to, with the experienced personnel that God has already blessed us to serve, come up with as many ways as, again, appropriate to be able to help. And so we have member care services and counseling services. And I was just talking today to a pastor who has a family in their church that was on the mission field for many years. And one of the family members suffers from post-traumatic stress from experiences on the field. And one of the ways that ABWE helps is trying to catch that early and help families deal with situations that can become exacerbated in a cross-cultural context. And that's an important one, but something as simple as, how do you file your taxes when you're living overseas? How do you manage your money? How do you do a tax-exempt receipt? These are things that can become daunting as you're trying to serve the Lord as an individual, as a sent missionary. And so we want to be helpful in that. And so, Alex, that would be the best way that I could answer your question. I think a ministry of helps is how we best serve. Scott, you look like you want to jump in there. Go ahead.
I was just talking to somebody this week about this, and an incredible single missionary wanting to go to a remote place, and she's going independently because she's a missionary kid and it was raised there and knows the groundwork. But my thought in talking to her was, and this was outside of an ABWE context, that was just in a local church context, was realizing like what an agency does is creates this network. So you may have a skill in one area and God's calling you to use that one area. So this lady was an educator and fluent in the language in which she was going to and knew the culture very well. But, clearly she's not a church planter, a primary, she can help in church planting, but she's not a lead church planter. She's not going to preach. And that isn't her calling and isn't what she wants to do. But she sees the need for that. Well, the beauty of an agency is that network of people that each have a role to play. And so you may want to do this, but you can be part of a larger movement because, what good is it if everyone learns English or if everyone's Ebola is cured, but they end up in hell? And also, how can people hear and listen to the gospel when they're suffering from Ebola or can't read the gospel? I mean, both things are needed, even though we understand the primacy of the proclaimed word and the importance of gospel proclamation and biblical teaching. So seeing a network come together of, okay, I'm a small church and maybe I send out 1 or 2 missionaries over the course of my pastorate, or maybe we send out 20, like that would be incredible. 20 still is not enough to reach the world. But together, and this is like kind of a common GARBC phrase, we're better together and we can do more together. And so an agency is able to say, okay, these are some things we're going to agree on together, and we're going to pursue these things together. And that way multiple churches can say, okay, you have a teacher? Great. I've got a young church planter. And do we have a nurse? I've got a nurse. And this is how agencies work. And by doing it this way, we also are able to see generations coming together of 40-year veterans and rookies. And so I think that's one of the beauties that I've enjoyed about an agency like ABWE, is to be able to see all these churches that have a similar heartbeat and a similar vision, be able to pull their people together to accomplish something they could never accomplish on their own. And I think that's it's a beautiful thing, and I'm grateful to be a part of it.
Mm-hmm.
Well, we want to condense some of this. We started with the question, how do you become a next level sending church? Obviously, that's something only God can do, but we can take certain steps, not just being intentional, that sounds vague, but intentional as far as be willing to give up pulpit time, be willing to proactively set aside budget and say, we will send a missionary at some point, who is it going to be? Asking God, asking the person directly, as Paul shared, saying, hey, we've seen certain gifts and inclinations in you. Would you consider it? And then would you come with me to ABWE's 24-hour demo, abwe.org/demo. Next one is coming up in the fall. It's October 29th through 30th. And there's another one happening the next 2 nights after that, a Friday and Saturday, October 30th through 31st. Make sure you come for that. Bring that person with you. When that person, it comes time to do a survey trip to that field, is that something you could organize a short-term trip from your church around that person? And maybe it's to an unreached people group that you've adopted through Live Global, liveglobal.org/unreached. But sending that person in a long-term missionary, career church planter type capacity is not the beginning of being a sending church. That's the finish line. There's so many culture building steps that can come between here and there. But we want you to know that ABWE is an organization that's laser focused on the local church, both here and abroad. We're committed to helping you take your next steps in sending, and we would love to partner with you. Please write to us. You can reach us, go@abwe.org. That's go@abwe.org. And if you're enjoying the session, again, if you follow the Missions Podcast through our website or through the Missions Podcast website or social media, you can get a hold of this breakout session after the fact. We're so grateful to be a part of the GARBC conference this year. Paul, any closing words to this group of pastors that we've been privileged to connect with today?
Yeah, I just so appreciate the GARBC. Historically, ABWE has found just a like-mindedness with the GARBC fellowship, and it's been a delight to. I grew up in a GARBC church, and it's been a delight to be so welcomed by GARBC churches and engaging with men and women who are passionate about the gospel, and churches that are passionate about the gospel and growing. And so, Alex and Scott, it's so great every year to be able to connect at the GARBC conference, and even to do this conversation is a delight. And I'm looking forward to the rest of the conference. And online, it's quite a bit different, but I'm grateful that we could be a part of it. And so I'm just grateful for what the GARBC is doing and how they're partnering together. You even mentioned that network is important, and so it's a delight to be a part of this. So thank you.
Scott, any closing words?
No, I seeing names pop up in here. Greg Linscott, just as someone I've interacted with for many years, and others. It makes me sad that we're not together and able to just enjoy fellowship. But it is a joy to be able to know, and as you see these names come across our screens, just a reminder of the blessing of being able to cooperate in ministry and fellowship together. And really grateful for this opportunity. And if you're ever out in California, especially if you're in the Bay Area, it's not as scary as the news makes it seem. Come out. It is a rich mission field, and would love to host you when you're here.
Yeah, and I would say that if you're anywhere close to the Harrisburg area, please come by and see us at ABWE's headquarters. We'd love to show you around and spend some time with you. So please feel free to stop by Harrisburg anytime you're close by.
And we're so glad to connect with all of you. abwe.org/demo is the event. Go@abwe.org is the email address. Thank you so much. And from ABWE and the Missions Podcast as well, thanks for being a part of this, and enjoy the rest of the conference.